February 16, 1944. Captain Ishida Yamamoto stood frozen at his optical rangefinder, watching two massive silhouettes materialize through the morning haze. His hands trembled against the cold metal eyepiece, not from the chill of the Pacific wind, from something far more terrifying. American battleship shells screamed through the sea and exploded in towering columns of white water, 200 yards from his destroyer, close enough that saltwater spray drenched every man on deck. Close enough that Yamamoto could taste the ocean on his lips. Close enough to kill. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. The enemy was hitting near him from 35,700 yards away, nearly 20 miles. A distance where his finest optical rangefinders could barely distinguish ship from cloud. A distance where Japanese doctrine said accurate gunnery was physically impossible. Yamamoto had spent 23 years perfecting the art of naval gunnery. He could measure distance with his naked eye more precisely than most men could with instruments. He had trained over 200 officers in the ancient discipline of optical fire control. His students served on every major warship in the combined fleet. He was considered the finest gunnery instructor in the Imperial Japanese Navy. And in this moment, every skill he possessed was completely worthless. His rangefinder operator's voice cracked through the speaking tube. The young man was barely controlling his panic. "Sir, they are firing from beyond visual range. We cannot even see their muzzle flashes." "How are they hitting us?" Yamamoto had no answer. He stared through the rangefinder at the distant shapes, watching them disappear and reappear in the haze, trying to calculate a firing solution with tools that suddenly felt medieval, primitive, obsolete. The Americans were doing something impossible. They were seeing in the dark, seeing through distance, seeing with eyes that weren't human. But this story doesn't begin with Captain Yamamoto standing on that destroyer deck, watching his entire worldview crumble. It begins 6 years earlier in a cramped office 3 floors above the Potomac River, with a man most Navy admirals dismissed as a dreamer. His name was Dr. Henry Fisher, 43 years old, electrical engineer. And he had an idea that everyone said was insane. March 1938, Washington, District of Columbia. Fisher sat at his desk in the Naval Research Laboratory, sketching the same diagram he had drawn 47 times before. A radar antenna feeding data directly into an analog computer. The computer calculating firing solutions automatically. Guns tracking targets without human intervention. A complete system that could see through darkness, fog, and distance itself. The desk was buried under technical drawings, mathematical calculations, and rejection letters from the Bureau of Ordnance. 11 rejections in 3 years, each one politely worded, each one saying the same thing. "Interesting concept, Dr. Fisher, but impractical for naval application. The Navy's current optical fire control systems are more than adequate. Thank you for your time." Fisher crumpled the latest rejection letter and threw it at the wastebasket. Missed. The paper joined 6 others scattered across the floor. He hadn't bothered to pick them up in 3 days. His office door opened without a knock. Margaret Fisher stood in the doorway holding a paper bag. Her husband hadn't come home last night. Again, she had brought him breakfast. Again. "Henry, you need to eat something." Fisher looked up from his calculations. His eyes were bloodshot. His shirt was the same one he had worn yesterday. Margaret set the bag on the only clear corner of his desk. Egg sandwich, black coffee, the same breakfast she had been bringing him for 20 years. She looked at the rejection letters on the floor, then at her husband's face. They said no again. It wasn't a question. She already knew. Fisher nodded. Margaret pulled up the only other chair in the office and sat down. She had learned years ago not to tell her husband to give up, not to suggest he move on to something else, not to remind him that they had bills to pay and he had a good government salary if he would just focus on normal projects. Because she knew why he couldn't let this go. She knew about Thomas. Fisher's younger brother had died in the darkness of November 1918, torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of France. The German ship had been invisible in the fog. By the time anyone saw the torpedo wake, it was too late. 127 American soldiers drowned that night. Thomas Fisher was 19 years old. Henry had been 23. He had made a promise at his brother's funeral. "No more Americans will die in the dark. Not if I can help it." 20 years later, he was still trying to keep that promise. Margaret reached across the desk and took her husband's hand. Her voice was gentle. "What are you going to do?" Fisher looked at the rejection letter, then at the diagram he had been perfecting for 3 years, then at his wife. "I don't know, Maggie, I honestly don't know." But someone else did. 3 floors below Fisher's office, Commander Robert Chen sat in the library of the Naval Research Laboratory reading a technical paper that would change everything. The paper was titled Radio Detection and Ranging Applications for Naval Fire Control. The author was Dr. Henry Fisher. Chen was 35 years old, Chinese American, one of only a handful of Asian officers in the United States Navy. He had graduated second in his class from Annapolis. He had stellar performance reviews. And he had been passed over for promotion 3 times because admirals kept finding reasons why he wasn't quite ready for more responsibility. He understood what it meant to be dismissed, to have your ideas ignored because of who you were rather than what you knew. Chen had been following Fisher's work for 2 years. He understood the mathematics. He understood the physics. More importantly, he understood the potential. This wasn't just a better rangefinder. This was a complete revolution in naval warfare, and the Navy was too blind to see it. Chen closed the technical paper and made a decision. He walked up 3 flights of stairs to Fisher's office, found the door half open, knocked anyway. Fisher looked up, expecting another colleague coming to offer sympathy about the latest rejection. Instead, he saw a young naval officer he vaguely recognized from the cafeteria. "Dr. Fisher, my name is Commander Robert Chen. I've read all of your papers on radar fire control, and I think the Bureau of Ordnance is making a catastrophic mistake by ignoring you." Fisher blinked, leaned back in his chair. Catastrophic mistake was not a phrase junior officers typically used about decisions made by admirals. "Commander, I appreciate the support, but I've been trying to convince them for 3 years. They're not interested in electronic fire control. They believe optical systems are perfectly adequate." Chen stepped into the office, closed the door behind him. "With respect, sir, they're not rejecting your idea because it's inadequate. They're rejecting it because it's too good, because it threatens everything they know, every skill they've spent their careers perfecting. You're not asking them to upgrade their tools. You're asking them to admit that human eyes and human calculators have fundamental limitations that technology can overcome. That's terrifying for men who have built their reputations on human excellence." Fisher stared at this young officer who had just articulated exactly what he had been feeling, but couldn't quite express. "Who are you?" Chen smiled. "Someone who knows what it's like to be told you're not good enough because you're different. Sir, you don't need to convince the admirals with words. You need to prove it with results. You need a demonstration that's so undeniable they have no choice but to approve your project." Fisher had heard this suggestion before, but every time he had proposed a demonstration, the Bureau of Ordnance had found reasons to delay or deny it. Budget constraints, scheduling conflicts, higher priorities. The truth was they didn't want to test a system that might prove them wrong. "How do I get them to approve a demonstration if they won't even read my proposals?" "You don't ask permission," Chen said. "You create a situation where they have to watch whether they want to or not. I know someone, a rear admiral who owes me a favor. A big favor. He can arrange a test at Dahlgren Proving Ground, but it has to be soon, and it has to be decisive. Your radar system versus traditional optical fire control. Head to head. Winner takes all." Fisher felt his pulse quicken. "When September, 6 months from now, I can get you the testing slot and the equipment budget. But Dr. Fisher, if this demonstration fails, you are done. They'll never fund you again. Are you confident enough in your system to stake your entire career on one test?" Fisher looked at the rejection letters on the floor, at the diagrams covering his desk, at 20 years of obsession compressed into one question. Was he confident? He thought about his brother Thomas, thought about every sailor who would die in the darkness of the next war if someone didn't find a way to see through it. "Yes," Fisher said, "I'm confident. Let's do it." Chen extended his hand. Fisher shook it. Neither man knew they had just started a chain of events that would change naval warfare forever. 6 months. Fisher had 6 months to turn a theoretical concept into a working prototype that could outperform systems the Navy had been perfecting for half a century. He assembled a team of 12 engineers, some from the Naval Research Laboratory, some borrowed from RCA and Bell Labs, all of them brilliant, all of them slightly crazy. The kind of men who heard the word impossible and thought that sounds interesting. The biggest challenge wasn't the radar itself. RCA had already demonstrated basic radar detection. Ships could be detected using radio waves. That part worked. The revolutionary element was integration. Fisher needed the radar to feed range and bearing data directly into an analog computer. The computer had to calculate the firing solution automatically, accounting for target speed, target bearing, wind speed, air temperature, barometric pressure, the rotation of the Earth. And it had to do all of this in seconds, not minutes. Fast enough to track a moving target. Fast enough to direct guns that weighed thousands of pounds. Fast enough to make human calculators obsolete. The team worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. They built the analog computer from scratch. Hundreds of gears, cams, and differentials machined to tolerances of 1,000th of an inch. Vacuum tubes that had to be individually calibrated. Electrical circuits that generated enough heat to melt their own components if the cooling system failed. By July, they had something that worked. Barely. A prototype radar connected by 200 feet of cable to a refrigerator-sized analog computer. The radar could detect a ship at 15,000 yards. The computer could calculate a basic firing solution in about 20 seconds. It was crude, temperamental, and it kept breaking down. August arrived, 1 month until the demonstration. The system worked in the laboratory, but nobody knew if it would work on the testing range. With real guns, real targets, real admirals watching every detail. Fisher hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in 3 months. His team was exhausted. The equipment was held together with solder and prayer, and they were about to bet everything on a single test. August 14th, 3 weeks before the demonstration. Disaster. Fisher was working late in the laboratory, testing the vacuum tube array for the 100th time, checking each connection, each calibration. Everything had to be perfect. Then he smelled smoke. He spun around, saw flames erupting from the analog computer housing, grabbed the fire extinguisher, sprayed foam everywhere. The flames died, but the damage was done. Half the vacuum tubes were destroyed. The electrical circuits were fried. 3 months of work reduced to melted slag. Fisher stood in the wreckage of his laboratory at 2 in the morning, holding an empty fire extinguisher, and felt something break inside him. Not the equipment. That could be rebuilt. What broke was his certainty, his confidence, his belief that he could actually pull this off. He called Chen at home, woke him up, told him what happened. Chen drove to the laboratory immediately, walked through the damage, assessed the situation with the cold calculation of a career military officer. Then he looked at Fisher. How long to rebuild? Fisher did the math in his head. If we work around the clock and nothing else goes wrong, maybe 2 weeks. But Commander, that only gives us 1 week to test before the demonstration. 1 week to make sure it actually works. That's not enough time. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something Fisher would never forget. Dr. Fisher, you told me you were confident in this system. Were you lying? No, I just meant that we need more time to properly test and verify before we put it in front of the admirals. There is no more time. September 15th is locked in. Admiral Pierce and 6 other senior officers will be at Dahlgren, whether your system works or not. You have 2 choices. Rebuild and test as much as you can in 3 weeks, or cancel the demonstration and spend the rest of your career wondering what might have happened if you had been brave enough to try. Fisher looked at the burned equipment, at the impossible timeline, at his own reflection in the laboratory window, haggard and exhausted and 43 years old with nothing to show for 20 years of obsession except rejection, letters, and a promise he made to a dead brother. We'll rebuild, he said. We'll make it work. For the next 2 weeks, Fisher's team worked without stopping. They slept in shifts on cots in the laboratory, ate meals at their workstations, rebuilt the entire system component by component, every vacuum tube tested individually, every circuit soldered with microscopic precision, every gear in the analog computer calibrated to perfection. September 1st, 2 weeks until the demonstration. The system was rebuilt. Time to test. They set up a target on the Potomac River. An old barge towed at walking speed. The radar acquired it at 12,000 yards. The computer calculated the firing solution. Everything worked. They tested it again, and again, and again, Every test successful. Fisher started to believe they might actually pull this off. September 12th, 3 days until the demonstration. Final equipment check before transport to Dahlgren. Fisher was testing the vacuum tube array one last time when tube number 7 failed. Not failed catastrophically with fire and smoke. Just failed. Stopped working. Dead. These vacuum tubes were custom fabricated. There were no spares in Washington. The nearest replacement was at a factory in Philadelphia, 200 miles away. And it was 9 o'clock at night. Fisher called Chen, explained the problem. "I'll go," Chen said. "Give me the specifications." "Commander, you don't have to drive 400 miles round trip in the middle of the night to get a vacuum tube. We can delay the demonstration." "No, we can't. The test is in 3 days. If we delay, Admiral Pierce will assume we're stalling because the system doesn't work. We get one chance at this, Henry. One. I'll be back by morning." Chen drove through the night, reached the factory at 2 in the morning, convinced the night watchman to let him in, found an engineer who could fabricate the tube, waited 4 hours while it was made, drove back to Washington as the sun came up. He arrived at the Naval Research Laboratory at 9 in the morning. Hadn't slept. Looked like he had aged 5 years overnight. Handed Fisher the vacuum tube. "Let's not do that again," Chen said. Fisher installed the tube. Tested it. Perfect. September 15th, 1938. The day everything changed. Dahlgren Proving Ground. Virginia, a military testing facility on the Potomac River where the Navy tested new weapons and equipment. Fisher and his team had transported all their equipment the day before, spent the night setting it up, connecting cables, calibrating instruments, praying nothing would break. Dawn arrived cold and clear. Perfect visibility, calm seas, conditions that favored traditional optical fire control. At 8 in the morning, Admiral Jonathan Pierce arrived, 58 years old, former battleship commander. A man who had spent 35 years in the Navy learning to trust his eyes and the eyes of his men. Behind him came 6 other admirals and senior captains. Men who had built their careers on optical gunnery. Men who were here to watch an electrical engineer embarrass himself. Fisher stood on the observation platform watching them arrive. His stomach was in knots. His hands were shaking. Everything he had worked toward for 3 years came down to the next 2 hours. Admiral Pierce approached him, shook his hand. The handshake was firm, but not warm. "Dr. Fisher, I understand you believe you can outperform our optical fire control systems with electronic equipment. Not just outperform, Admiral. I believe I can hit targets you can't even see." Pierce raised an eyebrow. "Bold claim. Let's see if your machine can back it up." The test was simple. A decommissioned destroyer was being towed at 10 knots, 12,000 yards offshore. 2 firing teams would compete. First, the traditional optical team would attempt to hit the target using standard Navy procedures. Then Fisher's radar-guided system would take its turn. The team with better accuracy and faster time would win. Pierce turned to his fire control officer, a veteran chief with 20 years of gunnery experience. "Chief, show Dr. Fisher how it's done." The chief nodded, moved to the optical rangefinder, began calling out ranges to his plotting team. The men worked with practiced efficiency, measuring distance, calculating wind drift, accounting for the movement of the target, doing everything by hand and eye the way the Navy had done it for generations. 3 minutes later, they fired the first 5-inch shell. The shell landed 200 yards short of the target. The chief corrected his calculations. Fired again, 150 yards over. Third shot, within 50 yards of the target. Close enough to be considered a hit under combat conditions. Total time from target acquisition to effective hit, 4 minutes, 15 seconds. The admirals nodded approvingly. This was exactly the performance they expected. Professional, reliable, proven. Admiral Pierce turned to Fisher. "Your turn, Doctor. Let's see this miracle machine." Fisher's mouth was dry. His heart was hammering. Everything came down to this moment. 20 years of obsession, 3 years of development, 6 months of preparation, 2 weeks of rebuilding after the fire, all compressed into the next 60 seconds. He activated the radar. The screen glowed green in the morning light. A bright blip appeared on the scope. The target destroyer, 12,000 yards away. The radar had acquired it instantly. No measuring, no estimating, just cold electronic certainty. Fisher flipped the switch that activated the analog computer. Inside the refrigerator-sized box, hundreds of gears began turning, calculating target bearing, target speed, wind conditions, temperature, air pressure, the rotation of the Earth beneath the moving target, mathematics happening at mechanical speed. 8 seconds later, a bell rang. Solution computed. Fisher looked at Admiral Pierce. Fire when ready, sir. Pierce nodded to the gun crew. They fired a single 5-inch shell. The shell arced through the morning sky. 47 seconds after the radar had first detected the target, the shell landed in the water, 50 yards from the destroyer, well within combat effectiveness range. The observation platform went silent. Admiral Pierce looked at his stopwatch. 47 seconds. You acquired, calculated, and fired in 47 seconds. Yes, sir. 4 minutes versus 47 seconds. The difference wasn't just impressive. It was devastating. It meant one ship with radar fire control could fire 5 times for every one shot a traditionally equipped ship could manage. In a naval battle, that kind of advantage was the difference between victory and annihilation. But Pierce was a thorough man, a skeptical man. One test wasn't enough to overcome 35 years of experience. Interesting, Dr. Fisher, but I notice you chose excellent conditions for your demonstration. Clear visibility, calm seas, exactly the conditions where optical fire control excels. I wonder how your system would perform in less ideal circumstances. Fisher had been waiting for this. He turned to Commander Chen, who was standing by the radio. Chen smiled and gave the signal to the towing vessel. Admiral, I'm glad you mentioned less than ideal circumstances. I'd like to propose a second test. The towing vessel began pumping thick black smoke from its stacks. Within 2 minutes, a massive smoke screen had formed across the water. The target destroyer disappeared completely. Visibility dropped to near zero. Pierce stared at the smoke screen, then at Fisher. What are you doing? Testing real-world combat conditions, Admiral. In actual naval warfare, there's smoke everywhere. From your own guns, from the enemy's guns, from burning ships, from deliberate smoke screens. I want to show you what happens when optical fire control can't see the target at all. Pierce turned to his fire control chief. Can you acquire the target? The chief looked through his optical rangefinder, squinted, adjusted the focus, looked again. Sir, I cannot see the target. It is completely obscured by smoke. I cannot provide a firing solution. So you would have to cease fire. Yes, sir. We would be firing blind, wasteful and ineffective. Pierce turned back to Fisher. There was a challenge in his eyes now. And your system, Fisher activated the radar again. On the screen, the target blip appeared exactly where it had been before. Bright, clear, perfect. The electromagnetic waves passed through the smoke as if it didn't exist. Admiral, to radio wave smoke is invisible. Our radar sees the target with the same clarity whether there's smoke or not, whether it's day or night, whether it's fog or rain or perfect visibility. The radar doesn't care. It just sees. Prove it. Fisher activated the analog computer. The gears turned. The calculation completed. The bell rang. He nodded to the gun crew. They fired into the smoke screen, into what appeared to be nothing but black clouds and empty air. 5 seconds later, the spotter's report crackled over the radio. Hit, 30 yards from target. Repeat, hit on invisible target. Complete silence on the observation platform. Then one of the admirals stood up, walked to the railing, stared at the smoke screen where a shell had just landed with impossible accuracy, turned back to the group. Gentlemen, his voice was quiet, almost reverent. I believe we just witnessed magic. Fisher stepped forward. Not magic, sir. Mathematics, physics, engineering. We built a system that can see what human eyes cannot see, calculate what human minds cannot calculate fast enough, direct weapons with precision that human hands cannot achieve. This isn't magic. This is the future. Admiral Pierce stood very still. His face was unreadable. 35 years of naval experience was colliding with something completely new. Something that challenged every assumption he had ever made about warfare at sea. Then he spoke. 4 words that changed everything. How much money do you need? Fisher felt his knees almost buckle with relief. $40 million, sir, and 5 years to make it operational. You have it. Both. I will personally present your proposal to the Chief of Naval Operations tomorrow morning. And Dr. Fisher, I owe you an apology. I should have listened to you 3 years ago. 3 months later, Fisher had a budget of $40 million, an astronomical sum in 1938. He had a team of 50 engineers. He had workshop space at the Naval Research Laboratory and 3 other facilities. He had priority access to materials and components. And he had 5 years to turn his prototype into a combat-ready system that could be installed on the Iowa-class battleships already being designed. The Mark 38 gunfire control system was born. But while Fisher was celebrating his victory in Washington, 6,000 miles away across the Pacific Ocean, a very different drama was unfolding. Nagasaki, Japan, September 1938, the same month as Fisher's demonstration. Captain Ishida Yamamoto stood in the shadow of the largest battleship under construction in the world. The Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, 72,000 tons of steel and ambition, armed with 18.1-inch guns, the most powerful naval weapons ever created. Yamamoto was 47 years old, chief gunnery instructor for the combined fleet. He had spent 23 years perfecting optical fire control, training men to measure distance by eye, to calculate firing solutions through sheer mental discipline, to hit targets at ranges that seemed impossible through dedication and skill. He believed in human excellence, believed that properly trained men could achieve things no machine ever could, believed that the spirit of Bushido channeled through rigorous training made Japanese naval crews superior to any in the world, and he was about to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. That same month, a young Japanese engineer named Yagi Hidetsugu had approached naval headquarters with a proposal. Yagi had developed a radar system, not as sophisticated as Fisher's, but functional. He wanted funding to integrate it into Japanese fire control systems. The proposal reached Yamamoto's desk as part of a technical review committee. He read it carefully, understood the physics, recognized the potential, and then he wrote his recommendation. Rejected. His reasoning was simple. The Navy's resources were limited. Every yen spent on unproven electronic systems was a yen not spent on training and perfecting the optical gunnery that had won Tsushima. The decisive battle doctrine required crews with exceptional skill. Machines were unreliable. Humans properly trained were the ultimate weapon. He signed the rejection and sent it forward, never knowing that he had just sealed the fate of thousands of his countrymen. Because while Yamamoto was rejecting radar technology, Admiral Takeo Kurosawa was in Tokyo finalizing plans for the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle strategy that had guided Japanese naval doctrine for 40 years. The strategy that assumed superior crew training would overcome any material disadvantage. The strategy that would lead directly to catastrophe. Kurosawa stood in the war room looking at maps of the Pacific, planning the decisive engagement that would destroy the American fleet in one climactic battle. He had the largest battleships ever built. He had crews trained to fanatical levels of proficiency. He had the element of surprise and the advantage of shorter supply lines. What he didn't have and didn't know he needed was the ability to see through darkness, through smoke, through distance itself. Two philosophies, two nations, both preparing for war, one investing in human excellence, one investing in technological superiority. Only one could be right, and the one that was wrong would pay the price in blood and fire and the sinking of empires. But that reckoning was still 6 years away. For now, in late 1938, both sides were confident. Both sides were preparing. Both sides believed victory was inevitable. Fisher returned home to Maryland 3 days after the Dahlgren demonstration. Margaret met him at the door. She saw his face and knew immediately. They approved it. $40 million. 5 years. Everything I asked for. She threw her arms around him, held him while he cried. 20 years of rejection and obsession finally validated. His brother's death finally given meaning. But that night, lying awake in bed, Fisher felt something unexpected. Not relief, not joy, fear. Because now he had to deliver. Now he had to turn a crude prototype into a system that could survive combat conditions. Salt water, humidity, vibration from the guns, electronic interference, enemy fire, 50 different ways it could fail. 50 different ways men could die because he had promised something he couldn't deliver. Margaret felt him tense beside her, asked what was wrong. "I'm terrified, Maggie. What if it doesn't work? What if I've convinced the Navy to invest everything in a system that fails the first time someone actually needs it? Then you'll fix it, because that's what you do. You solve impossible problems. You always have. Fisher wanted to believe her, but he kept thinking about his brother, about young men drowning in the dark, about the crushing responsibility of knowing that lives depended on whether his calculations were correct. 5 years seemed like a long time. It wasn't. The next morning, Fisher returned to the Naval Research Laboratory and began the real work, building the future. One vacuum tube at a time. 6,000 miles away, Captain Yamamoto stood on the deck of the Musashi watching his gunnery crews train, watching them measure distances, calculate solutions, perfect their craft. He felt proud, confident, certain that Japanese naval superiority was assured. He had no way of knowing that in 6 years he would stand on this same deck watching American aircraft swarm like locusts, watching his ship take hit after hit from an enemy that could coordinate attacks with electronic precision, watching everything he believed crumble into the sea. But that darkness was still ahead. For now, both men had hope. Both men had purpose. Both men believed they were preparing to save lives and serve their countries. Only one of them was right, and the world was about to find out which one. January 31st, 1944. The darkness before dawn hung over Kwajalein Atoll like a burial shroud. USS Iowa sat 3 miles offshore. Her massive 16-inch guns pointed toward the invisible Japanese fortifications that intelligence said were there. Somewhere, hidden in the blackness and the fog that had rolled in an hour before midnight. Seaman Michael Torres sat at the Mark 38 fire control console, staring at the green glow of the radar scope. 22 years old, from San Antonio, Texas. 6 months ago, he had been working in his father's auto repair shop. Now he was responsible for technology that could change the course of the war. His hands were shaking. The fire control room smelled like electrical ozone and nervous sweat. 4 other men crowded into the cramped space, all watching Torres, all waiting. This was it. The first time the Mark 38 system would be used in actual combat. 5 years of development, millions of dollars, thousands of hours of engineering, all coming down to whether a kid from Texas could read a radar scope correctly and trust a machine he barely understood. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Fire control, do you have the target?" Torres swallowed hard. His throat was desert dry. The radar showed a clear return, 22,000 yards, shore installations exactly where intelligence had predicted. But between the ship and the target was nothing but darkness and fog. No human eye could verify what the radar was showing. He had to trust the machine completely. "Sir, target acquired, range 2,000 yards. The words came out steadier than he felt. "Can you hit it?" Torres looked at the analog computer. The solution was calculated. The firing data was ready. The system said yes. But what if the system was wrong? What if the radar was picking up a false return? What if the computer had miscalculated? What if Dr. Fisher's miracle machine failed and Torres became the sailor who wasted ordnance and embarrassed the Navy in front of every admiral watching this operation? "Sir, the computer says yes. Solution is ready." A pause, then the captain's voice again, carrying the weight of a decision that would be studied by naval historians for decades. "Fire when ready." Torres pressed the firing key. The entire ship shuddered as 9 16-inch guns erupted simultaneously. The sound was beyond anything Torres had experienced. Not just loud, but physical. A pressure wave that squeezed his chest and rattled his teeth. In the cramped fire control room, loose objects jumped off shelves. Coffee cups fell and shattered. One of the other sailors grabbed the edge of the console to keep from falling. Torres watched the radar scope counting seconds. The shells would take over a minute to reach the target. 65 seconds of not knowing if he had just made history or destroyed his career. The intercom crackled. "Spotter reports shells away. Impact in 40 seconds. Torres counted. 39, 38, 37. His heart hammering with each number, and 0 distant flashes lit the fog like lightning inside clouds. Then the sound arrived, dull crumps of high explosive detonating against concrete and earth. The spotter's voice came back, and Torres could hear the disbelief in it. "Fire control, be advised, all rounds on target. Repeat, all 9 shells hit within effective radius. Direct hits on shore fortifications." The fire control room erupted in cheers. Men were slapping Torres on the back, shaking his hand, laughing with relief and amazement. They had done it. Hit a target they couldn't see in conditions where traditional fire control would have been completely blind with accuracy that seemed impossible. Torres slumped in his chair, his whole body trembling. "Oh my God," he whispered to nobody in particular. It worked. It actually worked. 3,000 miles away in Washington, Dr. Henry Fisher was asleep when the telegram arrived. His wife Margaret shook him awake at 4 in the morning. "Henry, there's a messenger at the door. Navy telegram. It's marked urgent." Fisher's heart seized. Urgent military telegrams at 4 in the morning meant something had gone wrong. A disaster. A failure. His system had killed people. He stumbled to the door in his bathrobe, took the telegram with shaking hands, tore it open. "First combat engagement, stop. Mark 38, performance exceeded expectations. Stop, direct hits, zero visibility. Stop, system works. Stop." Fisher read it 3 times. Then his knees buckled, and Margaret had to catch him. He wasn't falling from weakness. He was kneeling. 20 years of obsession validated in 11 words. His brother Thomas hadn't died for nothing. The promise he had made at that funeral in 1918 had finally been kept. Margaret knelt beside him on their front porch in suburban Maryland, holding her husband while he cried. Not from sadness, from a relief so profound it felt like being born again. But if Fisher could have seen what was happening 300 miles northwest of Kwajalein Atoll, his tears would have been very different. Captain Ishida Yamamoto stood at his post aboard the destroyer Nozaki, and for the first time in 23 years of naval service, he felt genuine terror. It was February 16, 1944, 16 days after Fisher received his telegram. Yamamoto's mission was simple: escort transport ships fleeing Truk Atoll after devastating American air raids. Routine convoy duty, low risk. He had done it 100 times. Then his radar operator called out, "Captain, unidentified contacts. Range 36,000 yards." Yamamoto checked his optical rangefinder. At 36,000 yards, over 20 miles, he could barely make out vague shapes on the horizon. Ships, probably, but impossible to identify with certainty. His rangefinder was designed for precision at 10 to 15,000 yards. At this distance, it was almost useless. "Hard to starboard," he ordered. "Increase speed to 30 knots. Something in his gut told him to evade immediately. Some instinct honed by 2 decades at sea. 15 seconds later, the first American salvo arrived. Yamamoto saw the shells before he heard them. Massive projectiles screaming out of the sky, leaving vapor trails through the morning air. They hit the water 200 yards from Nozaki's port side. The explosions threw columns of white water 100 feet into the air. Seawater rained down across the entire deck, soaking every man topside. But that wasn't what made Yamamoto's blood turn to ice. The Americans were firing from beyond effective visual range, from a distance where Yamamoto could barely see the enemy ships, let alone measure range accurately, from a position where Japanese doctrine said accurate gunnery was physically impossible. Yet they had just placed 9 heavy caliber shells within 200 yards of a moving target. "Return fire," he shouted. "Bearing 045. His gunnery officer looked through the rangefinder, desperation in his voice. "Sir, we cannot see the target clearly enough to establish an accurate firing solution." "Then estimate. Fire anyway." Nozaki's guns fired. Yamamoto watched the shells arc into the distance. Knew before they landed that they would fall short. Without accurate range data, they were firing blind, wasting ammunition, accomplishing nothing. The second American salvo arrived 30 seconds later. Closer this time, 150 yards. The ship rocked from the near misses. Yamamoto grabbed the rangefinder mount to keep from falling. He ordered full evasive maneuvers, zigzagging at maximum speed, changing course every 20 seconds. The desperate dance of a ship trying not to die. In 23 years of training, Yamamoto had learned that unpredictable movement made you harder to hit. That skilled rangefinder operators needed time to track your course and predict your position. But the Americans weren't tracking him with human eyes. The third salvo anticipated his turn perfectly. Landed where Nozaki was going to be, not where she had been. The shells straddled the ship, port and starboard. Close enough that shrapnel rattled against the hull like hail. Yamamoto understood then. A cold, terrible understanding that made him want to vomit. The Americans weren't guessing where his ship would be. They were calculating it. Some system, some technology he didn't understand was tracking his speed, his bearing, his rate of turn, predicting his position with mathematical precision, and there was nothing his skill or his training could do to counter it. He was fighting an enemy he couldn't see using weapons that couldn't reach them against technology that seemed like sorcery. This is not warfare, he said quietly to himself. This is execution. Nozaki escaped only because USS Iowa and USS New Jersey shifted their fire to a more valuable target. The light cruiser Katori, larger, slower, carrying more troops, a better return on ammunition expenditure. Yamamoto watched from 8,000 yards as Katori died, watched American shells rain down on her from ships she had never clearly seen, watched her list and burn and finally sink. 327 men went down with her, men Yamamoto had trained with, friends, colleagues, dead because they were fighting with human eyes against electronic ones. That night, Yamamoto sat in his tiny cabin aboard Nozaki trying to write his after-action report. His hands were still shaking. Not from fear, though he had been terrified. From the psychological shock of having his entire worldview shattered in 15 minutes. For 23 years, he had believed in human excellence. Believed that superior training could overcome material disadvantages. Believed that Japanese optical gunnery, perfected through decades of discipline, was the finest in the world. And in 15 minutes, the Americans had proven all of it irrelevant. He wrote 3 words he had never thought he would write. We cannot win. Not we might lose. Not the situation is difficult. Simply starkly, we cannot win. He continued. The Americans possess targeting capabilities that exceed our comprehension. They can engage targets from distances where our optical systems are completely ineffective. They can predict the movement of evasive targets with precision that suggests automated calculation. Recommend immediate investigation into enemy fire control technology and development of countermeasures. He sealed the report and sent it forward through channels. Knew it would reach Tokyo, knew it would be read by senior officers, and knew with absolute certainty that nothing would change. Because accepting his report meant accepting that 40 years of Japanese naval doctrine was obsolete of some. That the decisive battle strategy built around superior crew training was fundamentally flawed. That everything the Imperial Navy had invested in since Tsushima was based on assumptions that were no longer true. The Japanese Navy couldn't accept that. Not in February 1944. Not with Yamato and Musashi still afloat. Not when they were still planning for the climactic engagement that would destroy the American fleet and save the empire. So Yamamoto's report was filed, noted, and ignored. 8 months later, October 24th, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in human history, 282 ships, 199,696 aircraft, over 200,000 sailors and aviators, the decisive battle that Japanese doctrine had been planning for since 1905. Captain Yamamoto stood at his post aboard the super battleship Musashi, senior gunnery officer, responsible for directing the most powerful naval guns ever created, 18.1-inch rifles that could throw 3,220-pound shells over 26 miles, the ultimate expression of Japanese naval engineering and fighting spirit. He should have felt confident, proud, ready for the battle that would define his career and his nation's future. Instead, he felt a cold dread that had been growing since that morning off truck, because he knew what was coming, knew what the Americans had, knew that all the training and spirit and magnificent guns in the world wouldn't matter if you couldn't see the enemy and they could see you. At 10:26 in the morning, American carrier aircraft appeared on the horizon. Not a small raid, not a harassment strike. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes. Dozens of them, coordinated, relentless, attacking with a precision that spoke of electronic communication and calculated targeting. Yamamoto's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, 25mm cannons, manually aimed, manually loaded, each gun crew trying to track fast-moving aircraft through iron sights while the ship maneuvered at flank speed. It was hopeless from the beginning. The guns had no proximity fuses. The shells had to hit the aircraft directly to cause damage. No automated tracking, no radar guidance, Just human eyes and human reflexes trying to hit targets moving at 200 miles per hour through three-dimensional space. The first wave scored 3 bomb hits and 1 torpedo. Musashi shuddered but maintained speed. Damage control teams rushed to contain the flooding. Yamamoto allowed himself a moment of hope. His crew was well trained. They could handle this. Then the second wave arrived at 12:03. More torpedoes, more bombs. The ship began to list to port. Yamamoto ordered on counter-flooding of starboard compartments. Standard procedure. By the book. Everything his training had prepared him for. The third wave hit at 13:30, the fourth at 1500. Each attack precisely coordinated, each bomber knowing exactly where to aim because carrier air groups were communicating by radio, sharing targeting information, directing their attacks with a level of coordination that Japanese forces couldn't match. By mid-afternoon, Musashi had absorbed at least 17 bomb hits and 19 torpedo strikes. The largest battleship ever built was dying by inches. Yamamoto stood on the tilting deck watching water pour through ruptures in the hull, knowing with absolute certainty that this was the end. A young sailor approached him, 18 years old, face covered in oil and blood from a minor shrapnel wound, eyes wide with incomprehension. "Captain Yamamoto," he asked, his voice breaking, "did we do something wrong?" The question cut deeper than any bomb or torpedo could. This boy had trained exactly as he was told, followed every procedure, done everything right according to Japanese naval doctrine, and it hadn't mattered at all. "No, son," Yamamoto said gently. "We did everything right. We just did it for the wrong war." At 1935, the order came to abandon ship. Yamamoto helped the young sailor into a life vest, watched him jump into the oil-slicked water, watched 2,000 other men do the same, knew that 1,000 of them wouldn't survive. At 1943, Musashi's forward magazine exploded. The detonation was visible from 60 miles away. A mushroom cloud of fire and smoke rising 6 kilometers into the sky. The blast wave knocked men off their feet on ships 5 miles distant. Seismographs in the Philippines recorded the explosion as an earthquake. The largest battleship ever built broke apart like a child's toy. Her bow section sank first, dragging down hundreds of men who were still trying to escape from interior compartments. Her stern rose into the air, propellers still spinning uselessly before sliding beneath the waves. Yamamoto jumped into the water 5 seconds before the ship capsized. He surfaced in a debris field of burning oil, shattered wood, and drowning men. Swam through the carnage looking for survivors to help. Found the young sailor he had spoken to. Helped him grab onto a piece of floating wreckage. They floated there for 2 hours before a Japanese destroyer picked them up. Yamamoto spent those 2 hours watching Musashi's grave, watching the oil fires burn themselves out, watching the debris slowly disperse, thinking about everything he had believed and everything he had been wrong about. The ship had been destroyed without ever firing her main guns at an enemy surface vessel. The decisive battle she was built to fight never happened, because the Americans had changed the nature of naval warfare itself, had made the battleship's role obsolete, had proven that coordinated air power guided by electronic systems could destroy any surface ship no matter how heavily armored. 23 years of training, 2 decades of perfecting optical gunnery. All of it meaningless. Out of 2,399 crew members aboard Musashi, 1,023 died. Yamamoto survived, but something inside him had died with the ship. 3 days later, he was in Tokyo standing before a conference table full of admirals, reporting on the battle, trying to explain how the pride of the Japanese Navy had been sunk by aircraft. The admirals asked questions, wanted to know why the anti-aircraft guns hadn't been more effective, why damage control hadn't saved the ship, why the crew hadn't fought harder. Yamamoto answered each question patiently, professionally, until one admiral asked the question that broke something inside him. "Captain," the admiral said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "do you believe our crews lacked sufficient fighting spirit?" Yamamoto looked at this man who had never been in combat, who had spent the war in comfortable offices making plans based on assumptions that were 40 years out of date, who was trying to blame the loss of Musashi on insufficient dedication rather than face the truth that Japanese doctrine was fundamentally flawed. "No, Sir," Yamamoto said quietly. "Our crews had more fighting spirit than any force in history. They fought until they drowned, until they burned, until the ship literally broke apart beneath them. Spirit was never the problem. Then what was the problem, Captain? The problem, sir, was that we prepared for yesterday's war while the Americans prepared for tomorrow's. They invested in radar and electronic fire control, in coordinated communication systems. We invested in perfecting techniques that were already obsolete. And now, because we were too proud to admit that machines could do some things better than humans, over 1,000 men are dead. The room fell silent. No admiral wanted to acknowledge what Yamamoto had just said, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that everything they had built their careers on was wrong. One admiral finally spoke. Captain Yamamoto, you are clearly suffering from combat stress. You are relieved of duty pending psychological evaluation. Yamamoto understood. They weren't going to listen. Couldn't listen. The truth was too painful, too destructive to morale and doctrine, and the narrative that kept the military functioning. He saluted, left the conference room, walked out of naval headquarters into the streets of Tokyo, and for the first time since joining the Navy at age 19, he questioned whether any of it had been worth it. That night, in a small inn near the waterfront, Yamamoto wrote in his personal journal, the entry would be found after his death, would be studied by historians, would become a haunting testament to the cost of technological blindness. For 23 years, I taught men to trust their eyes and their training. I taught them that human excellence would always prevail. I was wrong, not because human excellence doesn't matter, but because I failed to understand that excellence means adapting to change, not resisting it. The Americans understood this. We did not. And 1,023 of my shipmates paid the price for our pride. He closed the journal, sat in the dark, thought about the young sailor who had asked if they had done something wrong, thought about all the men who had died doing exactly what they were trained to do, thought about how different things might have been if Japan had embraced radar technology when it was offered in 1938. But that was 6 years ago. 6 years when the decision could have been reversed, when Japanese engineers could have developed their own electronic fire control, when the outcome of the war might have been different. Now it was too late. The window had closed. Japan was fighting with 19th century tactics against 21st century technology, and no amount of spirit or courage or dedication could overcome that fundamental disparity. 3,000 miles away, Dr. Henry Fisher sat in his office at the Naval Research Laboratory reading combat reports from Leyte Gulf, reading about Musashi's destruction, reading casualty figures that made him feel sick. 1,023 dead. Japanese sailors who had done nothing wrong except serve their country, who had fought bravely and died because their leaders had failed to give them the tools they needed to survive. Fisher thought about the radar system he had built, the technology that had helped kill those men. He had created it to save American lives, had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. But the cost of that success was measured in Japanese corpses floating in the Sibuyan Sea. Margaret found him sitting in the dark staring at the reports, asked what was wrong. I built something that works too well, he said. These men, Maggie, these Japanese sailors, they were somebody's sons, somebody's brothers. They died because I made a machine that was better than their training. You made a machine that saved American lives, Margaret said firmly. Don't you dare feel guilty about that. Those Japanese sailors were trying to kill our boys. Your system made sure our boys came home instead. I know, Fisher said. I know that intellectually, but I can't stop thinking about them, about how it must have felt, doing everything right, fighting as hard as you possibly can, and still losing because someone on the other side of the world built a better mousetrap. Margaret sat beside him, took his hand. Henry, you didn't start this war. You didn't make Japan attack Pearl Harbor. You didn't force them to ignore radar technology when their own engineers offered it to them. You did your job. You protected American sailors. That's all you could do. That's all anyone could ask. Fisher wanted to believe her, but he kept thinking about Captain Yamamoto, kept imagining what it must have been like to watch your ship sink, your men die, your entire worldview collapse, to realize that everything you had spent your life perfecting was obsolete. He wondered if Yamamoto was still alive, wondered what he was thinking, wondered if they would ever meet. 7 years later they would. In a quiet office in Washington, two men whose lives had been shaped by the same technology from opposite sides. Two men who would discover they had more in common than either expected. Two men who would give each other something precious and rare, understanding. But that was still ahead. For now, in the autumn of 1944, both men sat in their separate darknesses. One mourning the death of a ship and a doctrine, one mourning the human cost of innovation, neither knowing that the war was about to demand even more from both of them. Because in 5 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy would make one final desperate gamble. Operation Tengo, the suicide mission of the battleship Yamato. And Captain Yamamoto would be aboard watching the last act of the tragedy he had tried to prevent. While in Washington, Fisher would receive orders to go to Pearl Harbor, to personally oversee fire control systems for the final assault on Japan, to miss his daughter's 7th birthday, his son's first day of school, to sacrifice even more of his family on the altar of duty and innovation. The war had taken so much from both men already. Before it ended, it would take even more. But it would also give them something, a story, a legacy, a truth that would outlive them both. That innovation wins, that adaptation wins, that the future always defeats the past, no matter how honorable that past might be. And that sometimes the men who build the future and the men who defend the past have more in common than either side wants to admit. Both are just trying to save lives, serve their countries, do what they believe is right. Only history gets to decide which one of them was correct. And sometimes history's verdict is more complicated than anyone expected. April 6, 1945. The battleship Yamato slipped away from her anchorage at Tokuyama in darkness, her massive hull cutting through black water without running lights. Captain Ashita Yamamoto stood on the navigation bridge watching Japan disappear behind them. He knew with absolute certainty that he would never see his homeland again. The mission was simple in its desperation. Operation Tengo, Heaven Number 1, steamed south to Okinawa where American forces were landing. Beach the ship on the island's shore. Use Yamato's 18.1-inch guns as stationary artillery until the ammunition ran out or the ship was destroyed. Then the crew would abandon ship and fight as infantry until they were killed. There was no plan for victory, no strategy for survival, just death with honor. Death that might inspire the Japanese people to continue fighting. Death that would prove the Navy still had fighting spirit even as the empire crumbled. Yamamoto looked at the fuel gauges. Enough oil for a one-way trip, not enough to return even if they somehow survived. The admirals had been explicit. This was a suicide mission. They were sending the largest battleship ever built, crewed by 2,778 men, to die. He thought about the young sailors sleeping in their bunks below. Most were teenagers, conscripts, boys who had been farming rice paddies 6 months ago and now were steaming towards certain death aboard a ship that symbolized everything wrong with Japanese naval strategy. Yamato was designed to fight other battleships, to win the decisive surface engagement that Japanese doctrine had promised since 1905. But that battle had never come, would never come, because the Americans had changed the rules, had made the battleship obsolete, and now Yamato was being sent on a mission that admitted, however implicitly, that she had no other purpose, that 72,000 tons of steel and pride were worthless except as a gesture, a symbol, a funeral pyre. Yamamoto had tried to convince his superiors that this was madness, had written reports, made arguments, presented the mathematics that showed Yamato would be destroyed by American aircraft long before reaching Okinawa. But his warnings had been dismissed, not because the admirals disagreed with his analysis, but because they couldn't afford to agree with it, couldn't admit that they were sending men to pointless deaths because admitting otherwise would mean acknowledging that everything they believed was wrong. So Yamato sailed, and Yamamoto sailed with her, because refusing would have been cowardice, because his crew needed experienced officers, because sometimes honor demands that you die for a cause you know is lost. He thought about the report he had written after Musashi sank, the report that had been ignored, the warnings that had been dismissed as combat stress and insufficient fighting spirit, and he understood with bitter clarity that he was about to prove his own predictions correct, was about to die because old men in Tokyo couldn't accept that the world had changed. The irony was savage. For 23 years, he had believed in the decisive battle doctrine, had trained crews to execute it perfectly, had rejected radar technology because he thought human excellence was superior to machines. And now he was dying because that same doctrine had trapped Japan in a strategic dead end from which there was no escape. A young ensign approached him, 20 years old, looked even younger. "Sir, the crew is asking about the mission." "What should I tell them?" "Tell them the truth," Yamamoto said. "Tell them we are sailing to Okinawa to support our ground forces. Tell them we will beach the ship and use our guns against the American landing fleet. Tell them we are unlikely to survive. And tell them that their courage will be remembered as long as Japan exists." The ensign's face went pale, but he saluted and left to inform the crew. Yamamoto watched him go, thought about all the boys just like him who would be dead in 2 days, thought about their families who would receive telegrams saying their sons had died heroically, would never know that their deaths accomplished nothing, changed nothing, mattered only as symbols in a war that was already lost. April 7th, 1945. Dawn broke clear and calm. Perfect flying weather. Yamato was 200 miles north of Okinawa, still 6 hours from the beaching point, still surrounded by deep water where a ship could sink completely. At 12:32 in the afternoon, the radar operator called out, "Aircraft contacts. Multiple groups, bearing WWII, range 40 miles and closing." Yamamoto felt something cold settle in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been dreading since leaving port, the moment that would prove every warning he had written was correct. He ordered all anti-aircraft stations to prepare for engagement, watched his crews rush to their posts, young men who had trained for months, who knew their jobs, who would fight with everything they had, and who were about to discover that training and courage were not enough against the technology bearing down on them. The American aircraft appeared on the horizon like a swarm of insects: Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, Avenger torpedo planes. Not dozens, hundreds. Launched from multiple aircraft carriers coordinated by radio communication, attacking with the precision of a system that had practiced this exact scenario dozens of times. Yamamoto's anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The 25mm cannons that had failed to save Musashi, manually aimed, manually loaded, firing shells that had to hit the aircraft directly because Japan had never developed proximity fuses, because Japanese doctrine had prioritized other technologies, because the same philosophy that rejected radar had rejected every other innovation that might have saved them. The first wave of torpedo bombers came in low, skimming the wave tops, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. Yamamoto's guns swiveled frantically, trying to track targets that moved too fast from too many angles with too much coordination. The first torpedo hit at 12:35. Port side amidships, Yamato shuddered. Damage control teams rushed to contain the flooding. Yamamoto checked the list. 2 degrees, manageable. They could survive this. Then the dive bombers attacked. They came from 12,000 feet, nearly vertical dives, releasing their bombs at the last possible second before pulling up. Each pilot had practiced this maneuver hundreds of times. Each bomb was aimed with the benefit of training that American industrial capacity could afford and Japanese industrial capacity could not. 3 bombs hit in quick succession. 1 penetrated the main deck. 1 struck the number 2 turret. 1 exploded against the superstructure. Fire and smoke erupted across the ship. Men screamed, metal twisted, and still the aircraft kept coming. Second wave at 1300. More torpedoes, more bombs. Yamamoto stood at his post directing fire control, knowing it was futile, but doing it anyway because that was his duty, because his crew needed to see their officers maintaining discipline even as the ship died around them. The list increased to 10 degrees, then 15. Counterflooding helped, but couldn't compensate for the massive damage. Water was pouring in faster than the pumps could handle. The ship was settling deeper into the sea with each passing minute. Third wave at 1400. Fourth wave at 1425. Relentless, coordinated, executed with the efficiency of an industrial process. This wasn't combat. This was slaughter. A helpless giant being carved apart by enemies it couldn't reach. By 1400, Yamato had absorbed at least 17 bomb hits and 19 torpedo strikes. The exact number was impossible to determine because explosions were happening so frequently that individual hits blurred together. The list had reached 20 degrees. Gun turrets couldn't traverse properly. Half the anti-aircraft guns were silenced. The ship was dying and everyone aboard knew it. Yamamoto found the same young ensign he had spoken to the night before, The boy's uniform was torn and bloody. Shrapnel had cut his face. He was crying, not from fear, from rage and helplessness. "Sir, why can't we fight back? Why can't we hit them? Because we prepared for the wrong war," Yamamoto said. "Because we believed courage was enough. We were wrong." At 14:15, the captain ordered abandon ship. 2,778 men began the desperate scramble to escape a vessel that was capsizing beneath them. Some jumped from the main deck. Some climbed down ropes. Some were trapped in interior compartments and never made it out. Yamamoto helped men into life vests, pushed them toward the railings, counted seconds until the ship rolled completely. He had been through this before, on Musashi, knew exactly what was coming. At 14:23, Yamato's forward magazine exploded. The blast was visible from 160 kilometers away, a fireball that rose 6,000 meters into the sky. The shock wave was detected on seismographs in the Philippines. Windows broke on Okinawa. Men on ships 30 kilometers distant were knocked off their feet by the concussion. The largest battleship ever built broke apart like kindling. Her bow section disintegrated instantly, vaporized by the detonation of hundreds of tons of high explosive. Her stern rose into the air, screws still turning, before sliding beneath the waves in a cloud of steam and smoke. Yamamoto was thrown into the water by the blast wave. Surfaced in a debris field of burning oil, shattered wood drowning men, and the broken pieces of Japanese naval supremacy. He swam, grabbed onto a floating piece of wreckage, watched his ship disappear. 2,778 men had sailed aboard Yamato. Only 276 survived. Over 2,000 dead in less than 2 hours. Killed by an enemy that had used technology to make traditional naval combat obsolete. Killed by a doctrine that refused to adapt. Killed by old men who couldn't admit they were wrong. Yamamoto floated in the oil-slicked water for 3 hours before a destroyer picked him up. He spent those 3 hours thinking about everything he had believed, everything he had taught, everything he had been wrong about. He thought about 1938 when Yagi Hidetsugu had proposed developing Japanese radar, when Yamamoto himself had written the rejection, when he had chosen to invest in perfecting optical gunnery instead of exploring new technology, when he had sealed the fate of thousands of men, including himself. He thought about the young ensign who had asked why they couldn't fight back. The boy had drowned. Yamamoto had watched him slip beneath the waves, too exhausted to swim any further. 20 years old, dead because admirals had made bad decisions in peacetime and wouldn't reverse them in war. He thought about Dr. Henry Fisher, the American engineer he had never met but whose technology had destroyed everything Yamamoto held dear. And he realized something that surprised him. He didn't hate Fisher, couldn't hate him, because Fisher had done exactly what Yamamoto would have done in his position, had tried to protect his countrymen using the best methods available, had succeeded brilliantly at his mission. The difference was that American culture had allowed Fisher to succeed, had given him resources and support, had been willing to try something new even if it challenged existing doctrine, while Japanese culture had rejected Yagi, had clung to tradition, had valued form over function until the price was measured in thousands of corpses. The destroyer pulled Yamamoto from the water, wrapped him in blankets, gave him hot tea. The captain approached him, asked for a casualty count. Yamamoto told him, "Over 2,000 dead." The captain's face went gray. "All those men," the captain whispered. "For what? What did we accomplish?" "Nothing," Yamamoto said. "We proved that battleships are obsolete. We proved that courage alone cannot overcome technology. We proved that Japanese naval doctrine based on assumptions that are no longer true. That is what we accomplished. 2,000 deaths to prove what I had already written in my reports." 3 weeks later, Yamamoto was back in Tokyo, no longer on active duty. The Navy had quietly relieved him, not officially for cowardice or failure, just reassigned him to training duties where he couldn't write any more demoralizing reports about technological inadequacy and doctrinal failure. He didn't care. The war was over anyway. Everyone knew it except the diehards, who still talked about fighting to the last Japanese citizen. American bombers were burning cities. The blockade was strangling the country. The atomic bombs would fall in 4 months. And then the emperor would surrender and the madness would finally end. Yamamoto spent those final months of war teaching young officers who would never see combat, teaching them gunnery techniques that were already obsolete, going through the motions because that was all that was left. On August 15, 1945, he listened to the Emperor's radio address announcing surrender. Felt relief more than shame. The dying would stop. The stupidity would end. Maybe now Japan could learn from its mistakes instead of dying for them. But he wondered if the lesson would be learned. If Japan would understand that the problem wasn't insufficient fighting spirit or inadequate training. The problem was cultural, the inability to adapt, the worship of tradition over innovation, the belief that human excellence alone could overcome material reality. 7 years later, December 15, 1952, Yamamoto would get his answer. He was part of a Japanese naval delegation visiting the United States. Japan's maritime self-defense force was being rebuilt with American assistance. The delegation was touring military facilities, learning about American technology, studying the systems that had defeated them. One stop was the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, a briefing on American fire control systems. Yamamoto sat in the conference room with 7 other Japanese officers listening to a presentation about radar-guided gunnery. The presenter was a man in his late 50s, thin, graying hair, tired eyes that held deep sadness. He spoke clearly but without arrogance, explained the Mark 38 system with technical precision, showed diagrams of radar integration, demonstrated how the analog computer calculated firing solutions. Yamamoto listened, understood, felt the old bitterness rise. This was the system that had destroyed his ships, killed his men, ended his career, and now he was sitting in a classroom learning about it like a student. After the presentation, the other Japanese officers asked technical questions, wanted to know about range capabilities, accuracy statistics, maintenance requirements, professional questions that showed they understood they needed to learn from the enemy that had beaten them. Yamamoto waited until the others had left, then approached the presenter through the interpreter. "Dr. Fisher," he said, "I must tell you something." The American looked surprised. "Yes, I was gunnery officer on Musashi when she sank. I was on Yamato's final mission. I survived both, because of your system." Fisher's face changed, the professional mask dropped. For a moment he looked stricken. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry for your losses." Yamamoto shook his head. "No, do not apologize. You did your job. You protected your sailors. That is what we all tried to do." He paused, gathered his thoughts. "For 7 years I have been angry at you, at your technology, at the unfairness that America could innovate while Japan could not. But coming here, learning how your system works, I understand something now." "What do you understand?" "That the problem was not you, was not your technology. The problem was us, was our culture. In 1938, a Japanese engineer proposed developing radar for naval use. I was on the review committee. I rejected it. I chose tradition over innovation. I killed my own men by making that choice." Fisher was quiet for a long moment, then said, "May I tell you something I've never told anyone, please? Every time I heard about a Japanese ship sinking, I thought about men like you, doing their duty, fighting for their country. I never celebrated those deaths. I built my system because my brother died in World War I. Died in the dark where nobody could see the enemy submarine. I wanted to save American lives, but I never wanted to kill Japanese sailors who were just trying to do the same thing for their side." They stood in silence. 2 men who had never met, who had fought on opposite sides of the largest war in history, who had both paid terrible prices for their dedication to duty. Yamamoto bowed deeply. Traditional Japanese bow of respect. "Dr. Fisher, they came here to learn about your technology, but you have given me something more valuable. You have given me understanding. For 7 years I have wondered if I failed my men, if I was inadequate, if I lacked courage. But now I see, I did not fail them. The system failed them. The doctrine failed them. The culture that valued form over function, tradition over innovation failed them. That understanding gives me peace." Fisher extended his hand. Yamamoto shook it. The handshake of equals. Of men who understood each other in ways their countries never could. "Can I show you something?" Fisher asked. Yamamoto nodded. Fisher led him to another room, showed him a photograph on the wall, a young man in World War I uniform. "This is my brother Thomas. He died in 1918. I promised at his funeral that no more Americans would die in the dark. I spent 20 years trying to keep that promise. The Mark 38 was the result. He pointed to another photograph. Recent, a family photo. This is my wife, Margaret, my daughter, Emma, my son, Thomas Jr., named after my brother. I missed Emma's 7th birthday working on fire control improvements for the Okinawa campaign. Missed Thomas's first day of school. The system saved American lives, but it cost me time with my family I can never get back. Yamamoto understood. Success has a price. For you, family time. For me, my ship and my men. We both paid. Fisher nodded. They walked back to the conference room, sat down across from each other, spoke for 2 more hours about technology, about war, about the burden of surviving when so many died, about the guilt of making decisions that killed people even when those decisions were correct. Before Yamamoto left, he asked one final question. Dr. Fisher, if you could go back to 1938, knowing everything you know now, knowing all the deaths your system would cause, would you still build it? Fisher thought for a long time, then said yes, because if I hadn't, someone else would have. Maybe someone who didn't care about my brother. Maybe someone who didn't think about the enemy sailors dying. Innovation happens whether we want it or not. The question is not whether to innovate. The question is whether we innovate with wisdom and compassion. Yamamoto considered this, then said, and if I could go back to 1938, I would approve Yagi's radar proposal, would tell my superiors that tradition must serve life, not the other way around, would fight to change our culture before it killed us. That is my answer. They shook hands again, exchanged addresses, promised to write, and they did. For the next 26 years until Fisher's death in 1978, the two men exchanged Christmas cards, brief notes about families and grandchildren and the small joys of life after war. Margaret helped Henry write them in his final years when arthritis made his handwriting difficult. Each card was a reminder that even across the chasm of war, human beings could recognize each other's humanity. Yamamoto kept every card Fisher sent, reread them sometimes, especially on the anniversary of Yamato's sinking. They gave him comfort, proof that his survival had meaning, that understanding could emerge from tragedy. Meanwhile, back in America, Fisher's life settled into a quieter rhythm. He continued working at the Naval Research Laboratory, refining fire control systems through the Korean War and beyond. When USS New Jersey was reactivated for Vietnam in 1968, Fisher personally oversaw upgrades to her Mark 38 system. The technology he had designed 30 years earlier was still saving American lives. His daughter Emma grew up to become an electrical engineer like her father. She worked at IBM, then later at a small startup that would become part of Texas Instruments. The precision thinking her father had demonstrated, the obsessive attention to detail, had passed to the next generation. His son Thomas Jr. became a naval officer, served aboard a guided missile destroyer in the 1960s, came home one day and told his father something that made the old man cry. Dad, Thomas said I was in the Combat Information Center today, looking at all the radar systems, all the computers that track targets and calculate firing solutions, and I realized this all came from you. Everything we do now, it started with what you built. You changed warfare forever. Fisher had smiled through his tears. I just tried to keep a promise to your uncle, that's all. The rest, that just happened. But Margaret knew better. She had watched her husband sacrifice sleep, health, family time, peace of mind for 20 years to turn that promise into reality. Had held him when he cried about Japanese casualties. Had supported him when admirals doubted. Had brought him breakfast in that cramped office when he was too obsessed to come home. When Fisher finally retired in 1968, age 73, Margaret insisted they take a vacation. Their first real vacation in 30 years. They drove cross-country, visiting national parks, staying in small motels, enjoying the freedom of having nowhere they had to be. One evening in Arizona, sitting on the hood of their car watching the sunset, Margaret asked him a question she had wondered about for decades. Henry, are you proud of what you built? Fisher thought for a long time. I'm proud that it worked. I'm proud that it saved American lives. I'm grateful that I could keep my promise to Thomas. But proud, I don't know. Pride seems like the wrong word for something that killed so many people. Even if they were the enemy, you saved more lives than you took, Margaret said gently. Every American sailor who came home because your system worked, that was you. Every family that didn't get a telegram saying their son was dead, that was you too. Fisher took her hand. I know. And I believe that intellectually. But emotionally, I'll always think about Captain Yamamoto, about those Japanese boys on Yamato who died doing their duty. War doesn't have winners, Maggie. Just survivors who have to live with what they did. They sat in silence watching the Arizona sky turn from gold to red to purple. After 44 years of marriage, Margaret understood that some wounds never fully healed. You just learn to live with them. Fisher died peacefully in 1978, age 83, with Margaret beside him. His obituary in the Washington Post was 3 paragraphs long. It mentioned his work on naval fire control systems without explaining their significance. Most people who read it had no idea who he was or what he had accomplished. But the Navy knew. Fisher's funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was attended by over 200 people. Admirals, engineers, sailors who had operated Mark 38 systems in combat, all of them understanding that they were burying a man who had changed history. Commander Robert Chen, now a retired Rear Admiral, gave the eulogy, spoke about the young officer who had believed in an impossible dream, who had risked his career on one demonstration, who had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Margaret sat in the front row holding the telegram from 1944. First combat engagement stop. Mark 38 performance exceeded expectations. The telegram that had made her husband cry with relief. The moment when 20 years of obsession had been validated. After the funeral, Emma approached her mother. Mom, I want to show you something. She led Margaret to the Naval Museum at the Washington Navy Yard, to an exhibit on naval technology. And there in a glass case was one of the original Mark 38 fire control computers. The brass plaque read, designed by Dr. Henry Fisher, 1938 to 1943. Revolutionary radar-integrated fire control system that gave the U.S. Navy decisive technological advantage in World War II. Emma watched her mother read the plaque. Read it again. Touch the glass case gently. He would have hated this, Margaret said, smiling through tears. All this attention, he just wanted to keep a promise to his brother. But he kept it, Emma said. And because of that, thousands of other brothers came home, including Uncle Thomas's son, if he had lived to have one. Dad gave other families the future Thomas never got. Margaret nodded. That would have mattered to him. More than any medal or plaque. That would have been enough. Across the Pacific in a modest house in suburban Tokyo, Yamamoto received the news of Fisher's death through their network of Christmas card correspondence. He sat for a long time holding the letter that informed him his former enemy, his unlikely friend, was gone. His grandson Koji found him there, tears on the old man's face. Grandfather, what's wrong? A friend died, Yamamoto said. A man I met only once for a few hours 43 years ago. But he understood me in ways most people never could. Koji was 15 years old enough to ask intelligent questions. What made him your friend if he was your enemy? Yamamoto thought about this because he was trying to do the same thing I was. Protect his people, serve his country. And because when we finally met after the war was over, we both realized that we were never really enemies. We were just men on different sides of a conflict neither of us started, fighting for the same things: honor, duty, the belief that what we did mattered. He showed Koji the Christmas cards, 26 years of them, each one a small bridge across the chasm of war. Remember this, Koji. The world will tell you to hate your enemies, to see them as less than human. But your enemy is just another person who believes their cause is right, just as you believe yours is right. And if you survive, if you're fortunate enough to make peace, you might discover that you have more in common than you ever knew. Koji would remember that conversation for the rest of his life, would think about it when he became an engineer himself, would apply that lesson of understanding across differences, of recognizing shared humanity in everything he did. Yamamoto died in 1985, age 85. His funeral was small, family mostly, a few former students. The Japanese press barely mentioned it. Another veteran of a war the country had spent 40 years trying to forget. But his grandson Koji kept the Christmas cards, donated them years later to the Naval History Museum in Yokosuka, where they sit now in a small display case next to Koji's handwritten explanation. These cards represent an extraordinary friendship between former enemies. Captain Yamamoto and Dr. Fisher never saw each other again after their meeting in 1952, but for 26 years they maintained this correspondence. A reminder that even in war, even across battle lines, human beings can recognize each other's humanity. Today, visitors to 4 American cities can tour the Iowa-class battleships: USS Iowa in Los Angeles, USS New Jersey in Camden, USS Missouri in Pearl Harbor, USS Wisconsin in Norfolk, all of them preserved as museum ships. If you walk through the fire control rooms, you'll see the Mark 38 equipment, the radar displays, the analog computers, the systems that revolutionized naval warfare. Most visitors walk past without understanding what they're seeing, but occasionally someone stops, reads the small plaque that mentions Dr. Henry Fisher, and if they're curious enough to ask a tour guide, they might hear the story about an electrical engineer who spent 20 years trying to keep a promise to his dead brother, about a system that could see through darkness and distance, about the first combat engagement at Kwajalein, where Seaman Michael Torres trusted a machine in the dark and made history. Torres incidentally survived the war, returned to San Antonio, used his GI Bill to study electrical engineering at Texas A&M, opened an electronics repair shop on the south side of town, told his grandchildren about the night he pressed a button that fired 9 shells at a target he couldn't see and proved that the future belonged to those brave enough to trust it. He died in 1989, age 67, surrounded by family. Never famous, never wealthy, but proud of what he had done. Proud that when it mattered most, when everything depended on whether one sailor could trust Dr. Fisher's impossible machine, he had the courage to press that button. His grandson still runs the repair shop, still has the commendation letter Torres received after Kwajalein, still tells customers about his grandfather who helped change warfare forever. These are the invisible legacies, the connections across time and distance that matter more than monuments or medals. Every GPS-guided weapon system in the modern military traces its conceptual lineage to Fisher's work. Sensors detecting targets, computers calculating solutions, automated systems removing human limitation. The Mark 38 was the ancestor of everything that followed. Every autonomous vehicle on the road today uses the same basic principle. See what humans cannot see, calculate faster than humans can think, react more precisely than humans can act. The smartphone in your pocket contains more computing power than all the Mark 38 systems on all 4 Iowa-class battleships combined. But the philosophy is the same: technology extending human capability beyond natural limits. Fisher would be amazed by this, would probably spend hours taking apart a modern smartphone to understand how it works, would marvel at the miniaturization, the processing speed, the capabilities that seemed like magic even to someone who had pioneered electronic fire control. But he would also ask the same questions he asked in 1938. Who benefits from this technology? Who is harmed? Are we innovating with wisdom and compassion, or just because we can, those questions matter? Perhaps more today than ever. Because the lesson of Fisher and Yamamoto isn't just that technology defeats tradition. It's more nuanced than that. The lesson is that technology without wisdom is just power, and power without compassion is just destruction. Fisher succeeded because he never forgot why he was building his system: to save lives, to keep a promise to his brother, to ensure no more Americans died in the dark. The human purpose guided the technical achievement. Yamamoto failed not because he lacked skill or dedication. He failed because he worshipped tradition for its own sake, because he valued form over function, because he couldn't admit when the world had changed and adaptation was necessary. But Yamamoto redeemed himself through understanding, through the humility to recognize his mistakes, through the wisdom to teach the next generation to be more flexible than he had been, through the grace to reach across the chasm of war and recognize his enemy's humanity. That's the real story. Not just who won and who lost, but what happened after, how former enemies became friends, how understanding emerged from tragedy, how 2 men who should have hated each other found common ground in shared loss and mutual respect. In 2012, 60 years after their meeting, a remarkable ceremony took place at the Naval Academy Museum in Annapolis. Emma Fisher, now 75 years old, donated her father's papers to the museum. Thousands of documents, technical drawings, calculations, correspondence, including a folder she had found after her mother's death. A folder labeled simply Yamamoto. Inside were copies of all 26 Christmas cards, plus something Emma hadn't known existed. A letter her father had written to Yamamoto in December 1977, a year before Fisher died. The letter had never been sent. Margaret had found it in Henry's desk after his death, sealed but not addressed. The museum curator asked Emma if he could read it aloud at the donation ceremony. She agreed. The letter read, "My dear friend Yamamoto, I am writing this, though I may never send it, because I need to tell you something I could not articulate when we met 25 years ago. You thanked me for giving you understanding, for helping you see that you did not fail your men, that the system failed them. But I must thank you for something equally important. You gave me absolution. For 26 years after the war ended, I carried the weight of every Japanese sailor who died because of my system. I told myself I was saving American lives, and that was true. But I could not escape the knowledge that I had built something that killed thousands of men who were just trying to do their duty. When we met, when you told me you did not hate me, when you acknowledged that we were both just trying to protect our people, you released me from a burden I had carried so long, I had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. You showed me that it is possible to serve your country with honor, to do your duty with dedication, and still recognize the humanity of those on the other side. You proved that war does not require hatred, that enemies can respect each other, that understanding is possible even after terrible loss. I hope Japan has learned from its mistakes as you learned from yours. I hope America has the wisdom to keep learning, to keep adapting, to never become so wedded to our current methods that we cannot see when the world has changed. Most of all, I hope that if there is another conflict, another war, the men who fight it will remember us. Will remember that the true victory is not in defeating your enemy, but in making peace with them afterward. In recognizing that we are all human, all trying to do what we think is right, all deserving of dignity and respect. Thank you, my friend, for your courage in surviving, for your wisdom in learning, for your grace in forgiving. You are a better man than most, and I am honored to have known you. With deepest respect, Henry Fisher. The curator finished reading. The room was silent. Then Emma noticed something remarkable. Sitting in the back row was a Japanese man, perhaps 50 years old, quietly weeping. After the ceremony, he approached her, introduced himself as Koji Yamamoto, grandson of Captain Ishida Yamamoto. He had flown from Tokyo specifically for this event, had brought something to donate to the museum as well. His grandfather's journal, the one Yamamoto had written in after Musashi sank, after Yamato went down, after the war ended, including entries about the meeting with Fisher, about the Christmas cards, about what that friendship had meant to a man who had lost everything except his honor. Emma and Koji stood together in the museum, two grandchildren of former enemies holding pieces of their grandfather's lives. Understanding in a way their own grandparents never fully could, that war's greatest tragedy is not the dying, but what it does to the survivors. They donated both collections to the museum, side by side, where they remain today. A small exhibit that most visitors walk past without noticing. But occasionally someone stops, reads the letters, looks at the Christmas cards, studies the photographs of two men who should have been enemies but chose to be friends. And perhaps, if we're fortunate, they learn something that matters. That innovation wins, but wisdom guides it, that tradition has value. But adaptation is survival, that enemies are human, just like you, that understanding is always possible, even after terrible loss, that grace exists, even in the darkest moments, that the future belongs not to those who hate most fiercely, but to those who have the courage to recognize their common humanity with those on the other side. This is the legacy of Dr. Henry Fisher and Captain Ishida Yamamoto. Not just the technology one created and the doctrine the other defended, but the friendship they built across the chasm of war, the understanding they achieved when understanding should have been impossible. The proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, there is still room for grace. That is worth remembering. That is worth preserving. That is worth teaching to every generation that follows, so that perhaps someday we can fight our battles without losing our humanity. So that perhaps someday the promise Henry Fisher made to his brother can extend beyond one nation's sailors to all nations' sons. So that perhaps someday no one will have to die in the dark. not because of better technology, but because we chose understanding over hatred, chose wisdom over tradition, chose grace over revenge. That would be the ultimate victory, not the one either man expected, but the one both would have wanted. The invisible thunder has long since faded. The battleships sit silent in their harbors. The men who built and fought with those magnificent machines are gone. But the lesson remains, and as long as we remember it, their sacrifice was not in vain.